Well, I think the first thing that has to happen is the U.S. has to be sidelined from the so-called peace process. As U.S. officials have admitted, they're not honest brokers. They're Israel's lawyer. That's a term used by Aaron David Miller, who's so for anything to happen, there needs to be an actual neutral player. You could think about, I don't know, Brazil, China, anybody but the hegemon that has overseen this fake peace process that has brought us to where we are today.
We've been saying for weeks now that it's vital to understand the wider, the deeper context for this current conflict, to be able to fully appreciate what's happening today. What do you think is the most misunderstood aspect of this conflict?
Well, the fundamental premise is that Israel doesn't have the right to fire a single bullet into Gaza. Occupiers don't have rights, they have obligations. And Israel has now been occupying Gaza and the West Bank for decades. And this whole conversation about Israel's so-called right to defend itself, even this hostage exchange, it obscures the fact that there's a fundamental problem here that's at the root of all of this, which is the occupation. And the prisoners are a good example of this. Why are thousands of Palestinian hostages inside Israeli prisons? If you look at the list of Palestinian hostages that are set to be released, the majority are teenage boys. What right does this occupying power have to be taking captive these young Palestinians, and some of them who are being arrested for throwing stones at the occupiers that have been stealing their land and oppressing them for so many years?
Aaron, it's interesting that you refer to them as hostages. I mean, that implies that the Israelis are looking for leverage by holding them.
Looking for leverage and also looking to crush the Palestinian spirit, looking to remind them who they are, which is the occupying power. And that's the part that gets obscured here. Joe Biden speaking there about bragging about how he's now finally allowing some meager amounts of aid into Gaza while simultaneously presiding over a mass murder campaign, doing everything he can to hide from the American public how much weaponry he's giving to Israel, doing everything he can to avoid any kinds of conditions on the military support he's providing. These 1,000 to 2,000 bombs that are being dropped on one of the most densely populated areas of the world. And so the idea here that there's any kind of parity between these two sides completely obscures the fundamental nature that this is an occupying power backed by the world's top superpower.
Usually when it comes to negotiating peace, opposing sides start by saying precisely what they want. If indeed, and judging by what we've heard from Joe Biden, there is a degree of a push towards lasting peace, behind the scenes at least, what does that say about what both sides want, namely Hamas and this right-wing Israeli government?
You know, I have no problem pointing out that when you look at the record, Hamas has had a far more accommodating position when it comes to the international consensus of what peace should look like in Israel-Palestine. Most of the world supports a two-state solution based on the 1967 borders. And that means Israel fully withdrawing from the West Bank and Gaza and the creation of a Palestinian state there. Hamas, over the years, has moderated its position and accepted that international consensus. It's only the extremists inside the Israeli government, backed by the U.S., that have rejected that. And by the way, it's not just this far-right Netanyahu government. That's every single government, including the architects of the so-called peace process, Yitzhak Rabin and Shimon Peres. There's no Israeli government that has ever accepted Palestinians' minimal rights. And that's at the heart of the obstacles to peace in the Middle East.
I think if history teaches us anything, it's that military solutions never bring about lasting peace. There will have to be, at some point, a political route out of this. Is there any voice for, when I say moderate voices, I say voices that more international players would be prepared to accept and engage with going forward?
Well, I think the first thing that has to happen is the U.S. has to be sidelined from the so-called peace process. As U.S. officials have admitted, they're not honest brokers. They're Israel's lawyer. That's a term used by Aaron David Miller, who's a former so-called peace process official from the U.S. So for anything to happen, there needs to be an actual neutral player. You could think about, I don't know, Brazil, China, anybody but the hegemon that has overseen this fake peace process that has brought us to where we are today. During the first years of the Oslo Accords, Israel's settlement activity doubled in the West Bank because, as Israeli officials made clear, their intention was never to accept a Palestinian state. It was to take over the parts of the West Bank that they wanted and let Palestinians live in these disconnected cantons. That's not a real peace process. That's apartheid. And for that to be reversed, somebody else needs to take charge and finally bring peace to Israel and Palestine.
Aaron Mate, it's been really good to hear your thoughts on that. Aaron Mate from the independent news website, The Grey Zone. Thanks for joining us.